Well, welcome back to our discussion titled Communism, the Dethroning of God. We are in section 3, or what I'll most likely put on YouTube. It'll be part 3, section 3, Cultural Marxism by Deception. If you refer to section 1 and 2, section 1 was theological or theoretical Marxism by education. It is a doctrine. It is the ideology of communism. Then section number 2 was military Marxism. That is how Marxism was carried out. That is how Karl Marx said it most likely would be carried out. He said it would only be carried out by force. And so section 3, we see cultural Marxism by deception. Karl Marx, as we mentioned, Marxism or communism was a religion for him. And when he and Friedrich Engels were recruited to write the Communist Manifesto for the various communist groups throughout Europe, initially they wanted to call it and they referred to it as a catechism. Then they talked about how they wanted to refer to it as a confession of faith. Well, that sounded too religious for them. But in fact, it is a religion. It has all of its tenets. He is certainly the proselytizer of communism. And so in his Marxist creed, the Communist Manifesto, he was sort of being a prophet. He was predicting that the proletariat, the working class, would rise up and overthrow the chains of oppression from the bourgeoisie, the ruling class. Well, that never took place. It never happened. And so some of his disciples further came along and said, well, Marx, maybe he just didn't have all the right components. So they kept the same tenets of Marxism, but they just said it has to be carried out in a different fashion. It wasn't going to be a uprising from the proletariat. It was going to have to be a top-down movement rather than a bottom-up movement. And so some of his disciples come up with what is known as cultural Marxism, and we want to take a look at what cultural Marxism is. First of all, let's look at the communist delusion. Karl Marx was an economist. He was a philosopher, and he spoke of dethroning God. He said that his chief goal in life was to dethrone God and destroy capitalism. So we see that this has more to do than just the economy. And then Friedrich Nietzsche, he was a philosopher, and of course he's famous for his God is dead, and of course we are his killers. So we see his target is God. Then you have Sigmund Freud. Sigmund Freud was a neurologist and a psychoanalyst, and he states he's popular for saying that Christians are mentally ill because they believe in absolute truth and deny their evil and base desires. As I mentioned earlier, the humanists, the communists, the atheists, they believe that humans are inherently good. Of course, that doctrine also has permeated the Western culture. But the Bible teaches a thing called original sin. The Bible teaches that we're all fallen creatures. And so as Christians, we believe that Jesus says that except you deny yourself every day, take up your cross and follow me, you cannot be my disciple. When it talks about denying yourself, it's not talking about denying food and clothing and shelter and working and provisions and clothing and all of that. It's talking about denying our evil passions, denying our fallen nature and following after Jesus's example. Well, Sigmund Freud said that was a mental illness to do something like that. You have to give vent to your passions. You have to give into it and go with it. And so we see that these three men were very influential in the ideology of Marxism and also humanism that we see today. Karl Marx established the cardinal principle that communism and capitalism cannot exist in the world together. He says our way of life, our system, must be totally destroyed. Well, I'm sorry, the Christian way of life must be totally destroyed. Then the world communist state will be erected on the ruins of the Christian civilization. In interpreting Marx, Lenin said, "It is inconceivable that the Soviet Republic should continue to exist for a long period side by side with imperialistic states. Ultimately, one or the other must conquer." And I need to back up with this. What this is I'm starting this off with a speech by an American patriot who is no longer with us. And I'll let you know who this individual is at the end of it. But this is excerpts from a speech that was given. And so we'll move on with this speech. This individual goes on and says, "Last November, the communist parties of 81 countries held a convention in Moscow, and on December 6th, reaffirmed this principle of war to the death. In a 20,000-word manifesto, they called on communists in countries where there were non-communist governments to be traitors and to work for the destruction of their own governments by subversion and treason. Only in that phase of the war, which causes our greatest fear, are we ahead the use of armed forces." In other words, and we're going to talk a little bit about the fact that the communist nations knew that their military is no match for the American military machine. And so, in other words, they're saying they have to come through different measures. As we mentioned, cultural Marxism is by deception. This speech goes on, the individual goes on in this speech, "Thanks to the dedicated patriotism and realistic thinking of our men in uniform, we would win a shooting war. But this isn't a decisive factor in the communist campaign. They never really intended to conquer us by force unless we yielded to a massive peace campaign and disarm. Then the Russians would resort to armed conflict if it could shortcut their timetable with no great risk to themselves." In 1923, Lenin said that they would take Eastern Europe, next organize the hordes of Asia, then surround the United States. And he predicted that last bastion of capitalism will not have to be taken. It will fall into our outstretched hands like an overripe fruit. So the last bastion of capitalism, he knew even back then, was the United States. United States has always been the target. The speaker goes on to say, "Meanwhile, other communist tactics are also working on schedule." Buganian said, "The American working man is too well fed. We cannot appeal to him. But when through inflation, America has priced herself out of the world market and unemployment follows, then we will settle our debt with the United States." American apathy is due, at least in part, to our belief that the small number of American communists is evidence of weakness and a lack of threat. But history makes no secret of the fact that Lenin became the leader of the world conspiracy on just that issue, that the Communist Party would remain a small, dedicated, highly trained cadre which would use and manipulate the masses when necessary. Lenin termed us the willing idiots, or some may know it also as useful idiots. The communists are supremely confident of victory. They believe that you and I, under the constant pressure of the Cold War, will give up, one by one, our democratic customs and traditions, will adopt emergency temporary totalitarian measures until one day we'll awaken to find we have grown so much like the enemy that we no longer have any cause for conflict. 3 months before his last visit to this country, Nikita Khrushchev said, "We can't expect the American people to jump from capitalism to communism, but we can assist their elected leaders in giving them small doses of socialism until they awaken one day to find they have communism." This is not a new thought. In 1788, James Madison told the Virginia Convention, "Since the general civilization of mankind, I believe there are more instances of the abridgment of the freedom of the people by gradual and silent encroachment on those in power than by violent and sudden usurpations." Who said this? Well, there's just a little bit more. Also, because this socialist ideology runs, the thread runs through many institutions, as we're going to see. Then also, he's almost finishing up with his speech, this Patriot. He goes on to say, a socialist clergyman writing in the New Leader, the socialist magazine of 1927, look how long ago the communists have been at this effort to bring America down. This socialist clergyman called for a new strategy. He says socialists should place themselves in government jobs and work for government ownership of power and control of railroads, banking, and key industries. He called his program encroaching control. Not too long ago, Norman Thomas, 6 times a candidate for president on the Socialist Party ticket, commented that the American people would never knowingly vote for socialism, but that under the name of liberalism, they would adopt every fragment of the socialist program. Appealing not to the worst, but to the best in our natures, they have used our sense of fair play, our willingness to compromise, and have perfected a technique of foot in the door legislation. Get any part of the proposed program accepted, then with the principle of governmental participation in that field established, work for expansion, always aiming at the ultimate goal, a government that will someday be a big brother to us all. Who said that? It was a speech entitled Encroaching Control. It was a speech given by Ronald Reagan while he was still an actor. It was delivered before the Orange County, California Press Club way back in July 28, 1961. Boy, how his words, he was almost prophetic. When you talk about, we mentioned earlier that Karl Marx attempted his prophetic work by writing the Communist Manifesto, and he predicted that the proletariat would rise up and overthrow the bourgeoisie. Well, that didn't happen, but Reagan lays it out clearly, the efforts of the Communist Party for a long time. And so he made this speech back in 1961, and we are certainly seeing it develop in our day. Well, how did we get here? Let's talk about cultural Marxism. America today is dominated by a system of beliefs, attitudes, and values that we have come to know as political correctness. In other words, cultural Marxism. Its roots lie in a version of Marxism which sees culture rather than the economy as the site of the class struggle. Karl Marx, he focused on the class struggle in terms of the economy. The proletariat were poor. They had nothing. They had no means of production. They had no property. They had nothing on their own. All they had was children and family. And of course, the bourgeoisie had everything. And they were the ruling class, and they oppressed the people. And so he just focused on the economy. He wanted this proletariat to rise up and take over and be in charge. But these cultural Marxists, they look at it and they say, no, it's not just the economy, but the entire culture. That's why it's called cultural Marxism. That is where the struggle lies. One group of Marxist intellectuals resolved this apparent contradiction of Marxist theory by an analysis that focused on society's cultural superstructure rather than on the economic base as Marx did. The Italian Marxist Antonio Gramsci and Hungarian Marxist George Lukács contributed the most to this new cultural Marxism. This is Antonio Gramsci. This is George Lukács. Let's learn a little bit about these individuals. Among Marxists, Gramsci is noted for his theory that cultural hegemony is the means to class dominance. So you dominate the culture and you dominate the classes. In his view, a new communist man had to be created through a change culture before any political revolution was possible. This led to a focus on the efforts of intellectuals in the fields of education and media. So the intellectuals and the media he had to get through to first, change their thinking change their way, make a new communist man, and then we can start to change the culture. George Lukács believed that for a new Marxist culture to emerge, the existing culture must be destroyed. And you see the bookends here. Marcuse was talking about, Antonio Gramsci, he was talking about indoctrinating a new man, making a new communist person to get into the culture. We'll start with the intellectuals and the media. He said, so we want to change their worldview. But then on the other hand, Lukács was talking about simultaneously destroying the old culture so that they can build a new one. He said, Lukács said, I saw the revolutionary destruction of society as the one and only solution to the cultural contradictions of the epoch. Such a worldwide overturning of values cannot take place without the annihilation of the old values and the creation of the new ones by the revolutionaries, by the individuals themselves. And these revolutionaries, we're going to find out, are the new proletariat, not just the working class. And we're going to show what the new proletariat is according to these cultural Marxists. So we must erase the old and establish a new order. In 1923, Lukács and other Marxist intellectuals associated with the Communist Party of Germany founded the Institute of Social Research at Frankfurt University in Frankfurt, Germany. This institute, which became known as the Frankfurt School, was modeled after the Marx-Engels Institute in Moscow. So we see that these individuals are searching for a new way to disseminate Marxism to the culture. They're still Marxists, they're still disciples of Karl Marx, but they're looking for a new tactic, a new way to further that ideology. In 1933, when Hitler came to power in Germany, the members of the Frankfurt School fled. Most came to the United States at the invitation of John Dewey and became influential in American universities. Look at that. When Hitler rose to power, these members of the Frankfurt School fled. First, they fled to Switzerland, and then they were invited to the United States by John Dewey, who we know as the father of modern public education. John Dewey was a Marxist. He definitely was influenced by Marxism, a follower of Marx. He invited the Frankfurt School over here. The Frankfurt School studies combined Marxist analysis with Freudian psychoanalysis to form the basis of what became known as critical theory. And so when John Dewey invited the Frankfurt School over here, they went to New York to Columbia University. And so they were very influential, and they taught in the school of Columbia University, and basically in their teacher's university, where teachers go to be trained. These individuals taught there and disseminated their information, their Marxist theories into Americans. Now, what happened is, after Hitler's demise, after the war was over in 1945, many of these Marxists went back to Germany because they were mostly Germans. They wanted to go back home. But one individual by the name of Herbert Marcus, he stayed and continued on, and he became sort of a revolutionary icon to many young people on the college campuses. So what is critical theory? Critical theory was essentially destructive criticism of the main elements of Western culture, including Christianity, capitalism, authority, the family, patriarchy, hierarchy, morality, tradition, sexual restraint, loyalty, patriotism, nationalism, heredity, ethnocentrism, and conservatism. So critical race theory is criticize everything about the culture. The cultural Marxists, they started to do that in Germany, where they criticized Western culture. But then when they came over to the United States, they carried that over into the United States. And so then they criticized everything about American culture, its foundings, its institutions, all of those things. It's called critical theory. And then also there's another theory that developed out of critical theory from a professor, Derek Bell, an African-American professor. He derived what he called the critical race theory, which evolved out of critical theory, and we'll discuss that a little bit later on. Critical theorists recognize that traditional beliefs and the existing social structure would have to be destroyed and then replaced with a new thinking that would become as much a part of elementary consciousness as the old one had been. Their theories took hold in the tumultuous 1960s when the Vietnam War opened a Pandora's box of revolution. In other words, they have found their new proletariat, and they're going to tell us who the new proletariat is. The student radicals of the era were strongly influenced by revolutionary ideals, among them those of Herbert Marcuse, a member of the Frankfurt School who preached the Great Refusal, a rejection of all basic Western concepts and an embrace of sexual liberation and the merits of feminist and Black revolutions. His primary thesis was that university students, ghetto Blacks, the alienated, the asocial, and the third world could take the place of the proletariat in the coming communist revolution. Right there, you see who the new proletariat is. Not just simply or merely the working class man, but all of these various groups, identity groups. I think Dinesh D'Souza calls it identity socialism. This is the new proletariat. Marcuse may be the most important member of the Frankfurt School in terms of the origins of political correctness, because he was the critical link to the counterculture of the 1960s. His objective was clear. One can rightly speak of a cultural revolution since the protest is directed toward the whole cultural establishment, including morality of existing society. Marcuse coined the phrase, make love, not war. The new left, or cultural Marxists, progressives, politically correct, organize themselves into multiple single issue groups. Here's the new proletariat: radical feminists, Black extremists, anti-war peace activists, animal rights groups, radical environmentalists and gay rights, trans rights groups. All of these groups pursue their piece of the radical agenda through a complex network of organizations such as the Gay, Straight, Lesbian Education Network, in other words, known as GLSEN, the American Civil Liberties Union, ACLU, People for the American Way, United for Peace and Justice, Planned Parenthood, Sexuality Information and Education Council of United Nations, and also Code Pink for Peace. All of these various groups have converged to form the new proletariat. Both communism and the new left are alive and thriving here in America. They favor code words such as tolerance, social justice, economic justice, peace, reproductive rights, sex education, and safe sex, as if sex is supposed to be dangerous. You know, the Bible teaches that sex was designed by God, and it's supposed to be between a husband and wife, man and wife, in marriage, monogamous marriage, until death do us part, and then sex doesn't have to be dangerous. But here they're talking about a sex education and safe sex. Then also talking about safe schools, microaggressions. Microaggressions is just silly. These people are implacable. There's absolutely nothing that you can do to please them, because they talk about microaggressions could be something as simple as a white person asking an African American where they're from. That's considered an aggression. So that's called microaggression. Inclusion, diversity, and sensitivity. So this is cultural Marxism disguised as multiculturalism. And I think even Angela Merkel just recently made a statement that mentions that multiculturalism has failed in Germany. So she even admitted that. Antonio Gramsci and Greg Lukács concluded that the Christianized West was the obstacle standing in the way of a communist new world order. The West would have to be conquered first. That's cultural Marxism. And Marxism knows that they cannot defeat America militarily, so they come another way. I know you see it on your screen, but let me say this again. Antonio Gramsci and Georges Lukács concluded that the Christianized West was the obstacle standing in the way of a new communist or communist new world order. The West would have to be conquered first. And the West is Christianity. That's, in their view, a Western civilization is heavily influenced by Christianity. We need to get Christianity out of the way. So this is more than just an economic movement. This is more than just a economic system. As I maintained from the start, this is a worldview. It is an evil ideology that exalts itself against the knowledge of God. Their fight is with God, just like Marx said, dethrone God. That's what they want to do. And oh, yes, capitalism as well, because they believe that they're all connected and related. Gramsci posited that because Christianity had been dominant in the West for over 2,000 years, not only was it fused with Western civilization, but it had corrupted the workers' class. That's one of the reasons why they were saying the workers would eventually rise up and revolt against the ruling class, and it never happened. So their excuse is, they're saying, well, what happens is those workers have been Christianized, and so therefore they won't do it. So therefore they need a new proletariat that's not influenced by Christianity in their minds. He goes on, the West would have to be de-Christianized. So folks, this is not just about economics. This is not just about money. This is a war against God, said Gramsci, by means of a long march through the culture and the institutions. He said that's how they were going to de-Christianize the West, is through a long march through the institutions. I'm sure some of you are familiar with that, the long march through the institutions, and we're going to talk about what some of those institutions are. Additionally, a new proletariat must be created. In his prison notebooks, he suggested that the new proletariat be comprised of many criminals, women, and radical minorities. Well, Antonio Gramsci wrote what's called the prison notebooks from an Italian prison, because Antonio Gramsci was a Marxist, but he lived in Italy. Benito Mussolini was a fascist, which is a national socialist. He was ahead. He was the dictator in Italy, and he's saying we'll have none of that here, and that's why he threw Gramsci into prison. And Gramsci languished, I think, for 20-something years in the prisons, but that didn't stop him. His Marxist ideologies. That's why it's amazing. And even I'll stop here for a second. Gramsci also was disabled in his body. Severely disabled in his body. So he couldn't take to the streets and carry out a revolution. But you don't always need that. Right? I should say you do need it, but the leaders don't always have to be that. They're always going to get a crowd of people to do their work for them. So although his body was disabled, obviously his mind wasn't disabled. This is the power of ideologies, of worldviews, of belief systems, of motivating ideologies. You can believe something so strong that it shapes your life, your passions. It drives you, just like Christianity drives Christians. Christians believe in Jesus Christ. We follow Jesus Christ. We follow his teachings and his example. Well, these ideologies do the same, and so they're very persuasive, and they're very influential. So from his prison bars, he wrote what's called the prison notebooks that led to a cultural revolution, to show you how strong ideals are. Let's talk, it's not a side note, but it's related. We're going to talk about Antonio Gramsci, but let's talk about Joseph Buttigieg, because we talked about how earlier cultural Marxism is going to seep into all of our institutions, and part of those institutions is government. The father of presidential hopeful Pete Buttigieg was a Marxist professor who spoke fondly of the Communist Manifesto and dedicated a significant portion of his academic career to the work of Italian communist founder Antonio Gramsci. Little Pete Buttigieg, who was running for president, he was one of those guys who said he wanted to be in the top seat of power in the United States of America. This is his father. His father was fascinated with the work of Antonio Gramsci. Mr. Buttigieg was a founding member and president of the International Gramsci Society. Professor Buttigieg edited and translated Antonio Gramsci's prison notes into English. He was also appointed by the Italian Minister of Culture to a commission of experts supervising Gramsci's complete works. I would say that this guy was sold out to the Marxist ideology. But look at the significance of this. Antonio Gramsci lived in Italy. He was in prison in Italy. He didn't travel around. He didn't go on speaking junkets because he was in prison. But he wrote these prison notes in Latin. That's the language of Italy. But Pete Buttigieg's father, he translated those prison notes somewhere in the 70s. Antonio Gramsci wrote his prison notes back in the 20s. And they were in Latin, locked up in Latin all those years. Well, here comes Pete Buttigieg. He translates that into English so that the Western civilization can have access to that. And of course, he directly, it went to the schools of higher learning, went into universities, and then individuals start studying Gramsci's ideologies and were influenced by Gramsci's ideologies. That's Joseph Buttigieg right there. And there's little Pete Buttigieg. And you're saying, well, what does that have to do with anything? Well, because Pete Buttigieg praised his father. He absolutely adored his father. They were very close. And that's a good thing. I'm not saying, I have two sons. I want my sons to love me and appreciate me. I try to pass on my ideals to my sons. And so does every father. But that's my point. We see the devotion that Joseph Buttigieg had to Marxism, and Pete was very fond of his father. We see, let me deal with this for a second. We see that Karl Marx's father was a capitalist. He was an attorney. He was also a Christian. He converted from Judaism to Christianity in his day to get away from the pressure of that time, certainly in Germany. But when there is a series of letters, and I downloaded the letters, correspondence between Karl Marx's father. He would write to Karl Marx often. Karl Marx's mother would write to him. His sister would write to him. And then Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels also would correspond with one another through letters. So we have all of that. And in those letters, you can see the type of individual Karl Marx's mother and father were. Good, God-fearing people. He was always appealing to, Karl Marx's father was always appealing to him to stop wasting and spending money. Stop living a reckless life. He was always appealing to him, turn to God, go to church, settle down, stop your drinking, stop the carousing. He was always appealing to that, like a good father would do. The mother was saying the same thing. He would always appeal to Karl Marx and say, get in touch with your mother. And he was always referred to her as your loving mother. And so Karl Marx's family, but Karl Marx despised his family because they didn't have the same view. Their world views were different. Karl Marx despised his family. He took his father's money, but he never took his father's advice. And then, unfortunately, when his father passed and his father left his wealth to the mother, the family, which is the way it should be, Karl Marx would often correspond to Friedrich Engels, and he would write and he would complain about his mother, and he called her an old lady. Called her the old lady. The only thing the old lady has for me is kind words. She doesn't have any money, because he wanted her money. He wanted to share in the inheritance, and she didn't want to send him any money because she knows that he was reckless with his money. He'd go through his finances and ruin. So he had a contentious relationship with his parents, although through these letters, you can clearly see his parents loved them, but he didn't return the favor to them. The same thing with Friedrich Engels. Friedrich Engels' father was a industrialist, and he was wealthy, but Friedrich Engels despised capitalism. Well, why did I go through all of that rant? Well, not so with little Pete Buttigieg. Not only did he adore his father, but he adored his father's ideologies. He agreed with them rather than disagreeing with them. So I believe you can love your parents, but if your parents have an evil ideology, you can say, Dad, I love you, but I can't go with you there. I'm going to always love you, but I can't follow you in your thinking and in your ideology, not with Pete Buttigieg. So that's what I'm saying. Here we have a man who was highly influenced by Marxism, and he was running for the president of the United States, and he's still young enough to where he's not finished yet. I'm sure he will be back. Excuse my little rant. Anyway, back to cultural Marxism. The new battleground, reasoned Gramsci, must become the culture, starting with the traditional family and completely engulfing the churches. So see that slow march, long march through the institutions. What institutions? First, the traditional family. They want to get into the traditional family. Well, remember, one of the tenets of the Communist Manifesto was also the abolition of the family. So we see the same thread here. It's not, they're not teaching anything different than what Karl Marx taught. They're just finding a new way to accomplish that goal. So it says they're going to start with the traditional family. The traditional family is husband, wife, man, woman, children. Then it says, and also completely engulfing churches, because that's the goal. We have to stop these Christians. We have to stop these churches from teaching people Christianity, because we're trying to create a new man, a new communist man. So then also schools. So the institution of the family, the institution of the church, the institution of schools, media, entertainment, civic organizations, literature, science, and history. All of these things must be radically transformed, and the social and cultural order gradually turned upside down, with the new proletariat placed in power at top. These are their stated goals. In 1919, George Lukács became deputy commissar for culture in the short-lived Bolshevik Belakoon regime in Hungary. So in other words, he was a sold-out communist. He immediately set plans in motion to de-Christianize Hungary. So this, again, this has to do with all of the West, but now certainly they are here in the United States, and the target is America, because they are the last great Christian capitalist holdout. He reasoned that if Christian sexual ethics could be undermined among children, then both the hated patriarchal family and the church would be dealt a crippling blow. Listen to his views. The hated patriarchal family, Marx hated that system. Engels hated that system. Lukács and all those communists, Marxists, they hate that patriarchal family system. They hate that structure because it is ordained by God. This is not the family is not a societal construct. You hear a lot of people say, well, these things are societal construct. No, God, in the beginning, God created man and woman. He said it's not good for the man to be alone. So he created a help who was suitable for him. And then he put them together. He says the two are one flesh. And then he told them to be fruitful, multiply, and fill the earth. That's where family comes from. So it's ordained by God. These men's target is God. They can't get their hands around God's throat, so they come after humans. These people's fight is with God. This is more than just an economic system. So they talked about the hated patriarchal family and the church. They hate also religion, will be dealt a crippling blow. Lukács launched a radical sex education program in the schools way back in 1919. People, this thing has been happening a long time. Many times we always measure things by our generation because we're subjective by nature. We normally say, I've never seen it so bad. It has never been like this before. Oh, look at what 1919, they've been doing this thing because they've been chipping away at it for a long time. They hate Christianity, they hate God. And so they know that if you can ruin a person's sexuality, you ruin their lives. Peter writes to us in 1 Peter chapter number 2, he says, abstain from fleshly lusts or fleshly desires which war against the soul. The founding fathers also knew when they talked about the Constitution, they said this Constitution was written for Christian people. It was written for a moral people. It is entirely incapable of governing any other type of person. They also talked about if you keep your morality, you will keep your freedom. But once you lose your morality, you will lose your freedoms. The founding fathers knew that. Well, these individuals know that also. And so that's their target. That's what they're going after, to seek to destroy. Sex lecturers were organized and literature handed out, which graphically instructed youth in free love, or in other words, promiscuity, and sexual intercourse, while simultaneously encouraging them to deride and reject Christian moral ethics. To deride and reject what? Christian moral ethics. Their aim is Christianity. They also deride Christian moral ethics, reject monogamy, and parental and church authority. Now we just cast off parental and church authority. This has been going on for a long time. Now you see where we are. Where we are right now is the fruit of all of this teaching. It usually takes generations before the doctrines and the teachings really take hold, and then they are played out. Behavior follows belief. Whatever a person believes, that's what they're going to live and carry out. And so we see this is taught a long time ago, and these very things that he mentions in our day is looked down upon. Monogamy, marriage. You'll hear people say, "Oh, your marriage is just a piece of paper. You don't need that." And so people choose to live together. And now we have all types of things. We have polygamy, polyamory, all of these things that we have. Monogamy is despised because it comes from God. It's not a social construct. God says, what God put together, don't let anyone put apart. And so this is what they're angry with. This is their goal. In 1950, the Frankfurt School augmented cultural Marxism with Theodor Adorno's ideal of the authoritarian personality. Theodor Adorno is one of the Frankfurt members, but he wrote, I don't know if it was a book or an article or literature called The Authoritarian Personality. This concept is premised on the notion that Christianity, capitalism, and the traditional family create a character prone to racism and fascism. So if you grow up in a Christian home, in a capitalist home, in a traditional family where you have a mother and a father and they're faithful to each other for life, you are a racist and a fascist. That environment creates a racist and a fascist. Thus, anyone who upholds American traditional moral values and institutions is both racist and fascist. Children raised by traditional value parents, we are told to believe, will almost certainly become racist and fascist. And don't we hear that word thrown around so easily nowadays? You're a racist. You disagree with the left. You're a racist. You're a fascist. They don't even know what the word means sometimes. I often say, if everything is racism, then nothing is racism. Sort of like the boy who cries wolf. By extension, if fascism and racism are endemic to America's traditional culture, then everyone raised in the traditions of God, family, patriotism, gun ownership, or free markets is in need of psychological help. That's why we all have phobias. Anybody who holds to God and Christianity and thinks that America is a great country and believe in marriage between a man and a woman and believe in God first and country and defending yourself, then you are phobic. You cling to God and your guns. That's why they talk about if you disagree with the homosexual lifestyle, you're a homophobe. If you disagree with radical Islamic terrorists, then you're an Islamophobe. And now you have the transgenders. You disagree with Bruce Jenner, who wants to be called Kate now, 6'2" man dressing up in a woman's dress and receiving the Woman of the Year. If you disagree with that, then you're a transphobe. All of these things that they're calling, because you need psychological help. You see how they pigeonhole you and they put you in a spot to where even if you disagree with them, disagreement to them means hate. And that's just ridiculous. It used to be a time where we tolerated one another's differences and we shared each other's views and we shared views with one another and then said, well, I just disagree with that view. And you said, okay, I disagree with you. Let's go get a cup of coffee. But nowadays, if you disagree with somebody, you're a hater and you're in need of psychological help. And then also we have that, again, critical theory, and out of that grew critical race theory, is an ongoing and brutal assault via vicious criticism relentlessly leveled against Christians, Christmas, the Boy Scouts, the Ten Commandments, our military, all aspects of traditional American culture and society, the police department. We have to defund the police, all of these things. This is critical theory. And critical race theory is a part of that. Critical race theory basically says that white America is irredeemably racist. They're always racist. They're racist to their core. They're racist in their DNA. As a matter of fact, Barack Obama once said that America was racist in its DNA. That's strong language. So that is critical race theory. In other words, white people are racist whether they know it or not, and white people are racist and they can't change. And then a good sign of a white person being racist is if they deny being racist. Well, that's proof that they're racist. You see this circular logic, you can never get out of it. It's madness. But these are the different types of theories that are cropping up out there and that are being embraced in American culture and taught in American schools and churches and media and academia. Let's look at Herbert Marcus. What time do I have? I'm just going to go for an hour. I got a couple more minutes before I hit my hour mark. I like to try to keep these talks to an hour and split them up. So this section is cultural Marxism. So most likely when you look for this on my YouTube channel, it'll be a part 1 and a part 2. So this, I might label this 1 of 1 or 1 of 2, depending on how long we're going to go, because there's a lot of information I want to share with you. So this may be a 3-parter. This section here, cultural Marxism, may be a 3-parter. We'll see. Anyway, let's keep going. We talked about the Frankfurt School. Who's this Herbert Marcus fella? He's part of the Frankfurt School. He was what I was talking about. Many of the members of the Frankfurt School, after the war, after WW2, they went back home. Hitler's gone. He's no longer a threat. They went back to Germany. Herbert Marcus, he stayed his behind over here to agitate a little bit more. Well, we see who is he with here. This is Angela Davis, Miss Angela Davis, Miss Black Panther, power to the movement, big earrings, big afro, Angela Davis. We're going to talk about who Herbert Marcus is. Herbert Marcus was mentor to Angela Davis. He taught her everything she knows. Here's Herbert Marcus. Let's listen to old Mr. Marcus for a second.
Of interest in Marxism among people in the West, especially educated young people. This also culminated in 1968, the year which saw the high point of student violence all over Europe and the United States, and looked for a moment in Paris as if it might even come close to genuine revolution. The would-be revolutionaries of that day proclaimed one man more than others as their political mentor, and that was Marcuse. They painted the walls with phrases from his books in order to make it known to the world that they were going to turn his ideas into reality.
I only mention the heritage of fascism. Fascism was militarily defeated. The potential for a repetition was still there. I would like to mention racism, sexism, the general insecurity, the pollution of the environment, the degradation of education, the degradation of work, and so on and so on. In other words, what exploded in the 60s and early 70s was a blatant contrast between the tremendous available social wealth and its miserable, destructive, and wasteful use.
So that's Herbert Marcus. And notice what the interviewer said, that many of the youth, the college youth, flocked to him. They wrote his sayings and slogans on bathroom walls and university walls. They flocked to him and they said him more than any other man was responsible for this revolution. Well, he stayed behind in here in America, and his influence was widespread in the universities until he passed on. He had a saying, liberating tolerance means, this is what tolerance means to them, intolerance against movements from the right and toleration of movements from the left. So you tolerate everything from the left and you tolerate nothing from the right. Well, again, that's nothing new. Jesus said that the world loves its own. So again, you make excuses. I always like to say, if you love somebody, they can do no wrong. If you hate somebody, they can do no right. And so any conservative movement Christians, there is no tolerance extended for them. But it's awfully funny because the left always march around, talks about tolerance, 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 tolerance. But we see what that means. They mean toleration toward anything that agrees with them and no toleration extended toward anyone else. Here is the new victim coalition proletariat. Non-whites, poor, illegal immigrants, radical feminists, LGBTQIA, and there's also sometimes you see it has a plus behind it because they're going to add to it. Because not only is it the lesbian, the gay, the bisexual, the gender, the queer, the intersex, and queer used to be a pejorative. It used to be something, you don't want to call anybody a queer, but now they embrace that word. They own it because, again, it's all about controlling the narrative. And so they refer to themselves as queer. But the reason why it's the LGBTQIA plus is because they're going to add to it. Pedophilia is next. Bestiality is coming. Polygamy, all of these things, that's the plus. All of these various groups cry oppression. They say they want minority status. And so that's why this, and of course, Muslims also. This is the new proletariat and growing. Well, who's the new bourgeoisie? Who's the new oppressor? White males, white capitalists, white Christians, white conservatives. And look at me, poor black boy who is a Christian, who's a male, who's a capitalist, who is a conservative. I just get called a coon and an Uncle Tom. I hear I have a lot of family members say, "Oh, you listening to the white man." Well, that phrase always cracks me up. Listening to the white man, and I'm like, what color was Herbert Marcus? What color was Antonio Gramsci? What color was Karl Marx and Joseph Stalin and Vladimir Lenin? I think they were white guys. And so, we get accused because they were Christians. You're listening to white guys. So I'm like, well, who are you listening to? If you're a Marxist, you're listening to a white guy. But anyway, the only bad guy, the oppressor, is not the white leftist, not the white atheist, not the white female, but the white male, the white capitalist, the white Christian, and the white conservative. And if you're black and you fit any of those, then you're just a coon, a sellout, an Uncle Tom. Boot shift, I forget what Larry Elder calls it, boot shuffling, whatever. All of those things that they call black people that just sort of roll off my back. It's funny. Candace Owens and various ones, they're trying to call her a racist. They're trying to call her a white supremacist. Are you kidding me? Are you delusional? Have you lost your mind? To call a black person, it's just stupid. Anyway, I'm done. Let me keep going. I don't want to get. Here we go. Let's talk about some of the players in this. As a matter of fact, it's 7:54. We're going to stop. We're going to talk about Howard Zinn. So we talk about the Frankfurt School. We talk about Antonio Gramsci, Georges Lukács, Herbert Marcuse. All of these individuals are players, very influential voices. These would be the evangelists. If Karl Marx is the apostle of communism, then these guys would be the evangelists, the preachers who make sure they carry his message on. Howard Zinn is very influential in the shaping of the American views over the past few decades, 3 or 4 decades. And we're going to talk about who this guy is. He was a Marxist. He has certainly gained a lot of popularity in our time to shape views of America in a negative light, because that's what critical theory does, is it makes America stink. There's absolutely nothing good about America. That's what the cultural Marxist job is to get American citizens to hate their country and despise it, because nobody defends what they hate. That's what these individuals have done. and Howard Zinn plays a big role in that. And so our next portion, except this is still section 3, cultural Marxism. So we're gonna, this is section 3, 1 of 2, and then look for 2 of 2, and I might even have to do 1 of 3, or 2 of 3, and all of that. We'll see how it winds up being on the YouTube channel, because we have a lot of information to cover. All right, we're going to stop right there. We'll pick up with Howard Zinn in our next video. God bless you.